Welcome to this Airwalk Reply podcast, The Big Questions in Tech, with your host, Alex Hammond, and security consultants, Costas, Kourmpoglou, and Dave Wilson. Together, they answer the big questions on cybersecurity.
Hi, welcome back to the next episode in The Big Questions in Tech with Airwalk Reply. I'm Alex Hammond, your host, and today we're on the second episode in our series around the big questions in cybersecurity. Costas, Dave, welcome back. Thank you.
Thanks.
Last time we touched on a host of different topics, really, but fundamentally it was what does modern cybersecurity look like? What was the kind of cliche? What does good look like? What are the challenges with that? And kind of what are some of the themes that we're seeing? What we're going to tackle today, hopefully, is kind of some of those kind of emerging themes that are a little bit outside of that, but are really kind of touchy subjects, challenging subjects, or things that actually we think maybe systemically are probably a bit of a challenge for the industry. And we'll kick off with one that's maybe, I guess you could argue, a bit controversial, something I think you're quite passionate about, Dave, potentially, a bit of a bee in your body about, is that concept of accreditations and possibly organizations hiding a little bit behind that when it comes to how secure they really are. And it probably touches on a little bit what we talked about in the first episode, which is that you can put out the perception of being secure and resilient, all those sorts of things. But really, is that actually moving the needle on how secure and resilient you are? And I think accreditations is a good example. Tell us why you've got a bee in your bonnet about it.
So I think initially accreditations have a function. Mm-hmm. And certainly I think they allow you to lay the foundations. They are useful in some regard because they are prescriptive, or mm-hmm. from a technical perspective, that's kind of with NIST. And ISO is quite good early on from a governance and risk perspective. But as our organizations scale, those will always kind of fall by the wayside. And there comes a point where, there's a kind of tacit agreement between the auditor and an organization or a risk and compliance function that they're kind of kayfabing, which is my favorite word.
Kayfabing.
Yeah. So it's a professional wrestling term where like you kind of accept that what's going on in the ring is real and or is at least staged.
Okay.
Because organizations are massive and auditors don't have the capacity to audit essentially everything that's going on.
Sure.
And I think you see that with cyber attacks where organizations aren't willfully trying to do the wrong thing, but they just don't have the ability to audit the entire organization. And
sure.
When we do supplier assurance and clients, people can say, yeah, we've got all of these accreditations. Look, here's our badge, and we were last audited. But it's essentially meaningless once you reach a certain kind of critical mass. And I don't, maybe not meaningless, but
a lot of the, and that's kind of an open secret, I think. A lot of the compliance and audit engagements that take place, they have an element, definitely, if not all of it, of performative security, kayfabing, right? Yes, here is a screenshot of how we have enabled MFA in those bits of the organization. These are not meaningful. They're point in time. They probably don't have the right context. But as audits happen in most cases, they follow a checklist. Yeah. And as we said in the previous episode, organizations will do the bare minimum in order to be able to comply. So there's definitely an element of that security theater that everyone participates when a big audit kind of takes place.
And it comes back to that mindset piece again, doesn't it? So if you do the things that you should be doing to secure your organization, you'll get the accreditation.
Yeah,
you'll pass the audit. It shouldn't be something like, I mean, we've all been there in clients or in industry where it's the oh crap moment. The auditor's coming, mad scramble. Let's pull it all together and let's, as you say, put on a good show. It should just be, oh, okay, they're here. Like actually, I mean, there was this concept, I think, that the regulator was asking for, which actually we want an ongoing view.
For sure.
We want you to be like, it should be we can just check in on the dashboard and see what's going on. And I suspect probably the lobby of the banking industry maybe put that to bed a little bit. I don't know if that's still coming, but that should be the way of things, shouldn't it? It should just be at any given, a bit like a drug test for American football players or something. They're going to turn up tomorrow without any warning.
Yeah.
And it should just be, yeah, okay, come on in. Let's see what you've got.
Yeah.
But it isn't that, is it? But it's that mindset to say, those things, we will pass those things if we're doing what we should be doing anyway. Yeah. That isn't the way it's all about, is it?
The balance kind of ticks on the scales. The balance sways on the other side as well sometimes, where the regulators potentially might come up with, let's say, not quite relevant or applicable guidance that doesn't help in the context secure or prove anything for that business function. So there is definitely, from the industry perspective, rightfully so, some resistance to some of those guidelines, right? But I think that relationship is always kind of evolving.
I do wonder sometimes if I'm going to bat for the regulator, this is very rare that I would, but if I go to bat for the regulator, I do think sometimes it's born out of impatience with the industry, though.
Yeah.
The number of times, like again, we're working with a client at the moment, regulatory-driven program, and ultimately the regulator just lost patience. And we said, we've asked you several times now for this stuff. We're not happy, so this is what you're doing prescriptively.
Yeah.
And is it the right thing technically? No. Is it adding any business value? No. But it's addressing the concern that they have in a way that the regulator's happy with. Had the organisation dealt with that the first time properly, it could have been a very different story. And I do think sometimes regulation is addressing that, I think, which is you can, as you say, you can tell that the industry isn't yet in a position where it's just by default we are doing the right thing and we are going to be resilient and secure because it's the right thing for our business. You get a bit of it, but I don't think we're there yet. If they were doing that, the regulator doesn't have to do those things, right? It can be much less prescriptive. Like, tell us how you're doing that. Show us how you're doing that. We're not going to inflict this stuff, but we're not in that world, right? So, yeah.
I think sometimes regulators have to have teeth. It's not a bad thing. People will, by definition, like slow roll change because it's difficult.
Yeah.
And sometimes if they do show their teeth, then it can actually benefit your organisation as well, because it gives that shock to the system and maybe the shock to the culture within the business that you can actually ultimately benefit from.
Absolutely.
If you take that if you heed the warnings almost.
It's funny though, isn't it?
You don't want it to happen all the time.
Well, but it's almost it's a shame that bad things often lead to good change, don't they? So whether that's the financial crisis led to better kind of capital controls, maybe dubiously, I suppose you could argue about that, but in theory, it's kind of the same thing with security, isn't it? Often an organisation maybe doesn't take it as serious as they should until something bad goes happen. But enough has happened in the industry. I think that there's certainly more investment in those sorts of functions than there has been, isn't there?
Absolutely, and the difference is very kind of vivid in how some of the regulators prescribe very kind of detailed ways of addressing some of their concerns, where other regulators kind of stick to the principles, and it's kind of telling where those regulators are coming from and what they need to see, and how, again, that landscape will always be evolving.
We're seeing that with DORA, aren't we? Which is quite prescriptive, I think, right?
Yes.
Versus the UK approach, which is a little bit more principles based.
Yeah. SS221 kind of sticks to some of the principles. DORA kind of prescribes, when we talk about, for example, threat-led penetration testing, how many test managers you need to have, how many penetration testers, to the point.
It's just almost impossible for a regulator to get that right first time, isn't it?
Absolutely,
it's in a moving feast.
Yeah, but the cycles of feedback that we've seen, those kind of regulatory pieces come in, they become longer. They give a lot more time. So there's definitely kind of a lot more feedback that the regulator is willing to receive versus, I think, probably 20 years ago, especially in IT.
And sometimes, again, kind of we talked about it last time around security being quite far removed. It's the same kind of with regulators. They're kind of almost doing or maybe they're not now with the feedback loop shortening, but they almost traditionally did the same thing that security teams did by being quite removed.
Well, it was almost worse than that, wasn't it? It wasn't the regular. I think the stick that the regulator was often hit by was, you don't tell us what you want to see. You tell us, well, just do it, and then I'll tell you if that's the right thing or not. And I suppose security could probably, maybe that's an approach that maybe security has historically taken, but it's almost impossible to really know how to operate in that kind of environment. And I think the world's moved on. I think the regulator, certainly in the UK, there's a different level of maturity now, I think, from a technology perspective than it has been. It's almost impossible for them to really stay ahead of the game because the level of investment you would need. But I think there is a different attitude to it. But yeah, that whole thing of, well, we don't know what the regulator's going to say until we've built it and take it to them. That's a difficult environment to operate in, isn't it?
It's a similarity with you're building a product, and then at the end, someone comes at your door, knocks, and says, "Hey, I've got a checklist to audit you." Surprise! That really isn't helpful.
No.
Because if you would only have known when you start building that thing, and someone worked with you to build that thing, that would have been a lot more useful. So that's absolutely the take that most businesses would have for a regulator.
Which I guess is why, I'm not enough of an expert to really have an opinion on whether the European approach is better or worse than the UK, but you kind of feel like a principles-based approach. It's more open to interpretation is probably the challenge for some of the organisations, but it gives that flexibility to kind of say, well, our view of this is that we are meeting the essence of that, and therefore we're kind of in the right place.
Yeah, I think that also from a security perspective, but also I think from a regulatory perspective, it's good to look at the outcomes. It's good to look at the security properties. How these are achieved is very difficult to try to enforce, because you can take 1,000 different paths to get to the same goal, right? And yeah, I'm sure there were some reasons on kind of being a lot more prescriptive. I think that for some organizations that might be a lot more valuable because they tell them exactly what they need to do. They give them part of the kind of prescriptive need comes the guidance, and that is also kind of a good thing to have.
I wonder if you think of, there must be several hundred, if not thousands, of FSIs within the purview of the European regulator. A lot of them quite small, probably haven't got the budgets and time to allocate to work out the problem. So actually being quite prescriptive helps them. And my guess would be, if you're a much larger entity under the purview of the ECB, you can probably have that debate and say, we get it, but this is how we're solving it. Let's talk. If you're small, you can't have that, but actually you just need to get on and do it. And probably you'd rather just be able to get on and do it.
Yeah. And on that kind of UK versus kind of EU almost approach, they've been influenced heavily by each other. So we see kind of CBEST kind of influencing DORA, and kind of DORA talking about Cyber-EU, which is the pen testing framework, which has also kind of been influenced. So there's definitely kind of a learning, which is good. It's a great thing to see kind of how that evolves hand to hand, almost hand in hand.
So we're doing a podcast in 2024, so we're going to talk about AI because it's kind of a necessary thing, really, isn't it? Apparently, but I think being serious for a second, I think it's an interesting one from a security perspective, isn't it? Because ultimately, it represents, whether they're knowingly doing it or not, it's from a data perspective, particularly in the more immature organizations or immature parts of organizations, they are inadvertently or otherwise giving their data out to other organizations. And let's talk about that. What's your perspective on, I guess, AI and the hype and what that looks like from a security perspective?
Yeah, so I've sometimes privately kind of compared Gen AI to ransomware. You need to pay good money in order to maintain the integrity and to maintain the confidentiality of your data. There's an incentive from a vast majority of organizations to use the data that you're feeding them to train the next models. That is part of their capabilities. That is part of their business model. And so that's how kind of that CMARC almost works. But I find that as part of an assistive technology and what it can do to help individuals, I think we're seeing some of those things coming up. There's definitely a hype curve. Mm-hmm. I don't know where we are in the hype curve, but it's almost a kind of a good thing to have to some extent.
Yeah, and I think just to speak to kind of the access to that data, and you're now actually seeing companies, because they need the data in order to then build the next model, they're actually changing things like terms and conditions, where they're essentially saying, once you use our product, what you put into that product, we actually might want to use that data.
Yeah.
And I think that's I think that's almost like a bad path to be going down from a security perspective.
Yeah.
So I think we need to certainly have AI security somewhere, whether it's a privacy thing or a security thing. But
and that is a big challenge for enterprises where, and for everyone, where we haven't really thought about the amount of data that we're giving out, and that kind of guidance was under kind of GDPR, was fairly out there. We're going to use your data for X, Y, Z.
Yeah.
Now there's new ways of kind of getting your data, and they are now kind of inscribed as part of the essential functionality of that product. So you get to either use that product, or you don't, or you need to pay a different pricing model in order to avoid having your data being used for the next iteration of that.
But it goes so much further than that as well, isn't it? The GDPR was, we're going to use your data, and it's probably going to use it to sell something to you, or maybe sell it to someone else, and they'll spam you with something. It was kind of trying to protect it. But now it's, we're going to take your data, and actually we're going to sell it to someone else that could be your competitor. It could be like it's a very different.
And they leverage GDPR because it's essentially consent. They put it into the terms and conditions, and if you like that product, then you should maybe use AI to like read the terms and conditions. What am I actually agreeing to? Which is a function of it.
The ramifications are a lot more kind of bigger. Right?
And security is difficult in the sense that it'll take us time to catch up on that.
Yeah, it feels like we could probably carve out a whole new episode around security of AI and all that sort of stuff. I get one question briefly for me would be in terms of use cases in security for AI. It feels like a very data-led function. It feels like they could be quite significant, and maybe tackle some of the shortcomings around. We're in a world now where organizations switch on a tool, fire off millions of logs a day, and go, oh yeah, we're doing what we need to do. And actually, there's some poor guy trying to monitor those in a dark room somewhere. That clearly doesn't work, but potentially AI, I guess, could solve for some of those things, or move the needle there.
Most definitely. I think that's one of the ideal functions for AI. It can actually rapidly, you can read it a lot faster than we can. Mm-hmm. Obviously, you have to then trust that AI. Is it making the right decisions? And that's kind of another factor to consider. But certainly, just the rapid consumption of it is certainly a use case that.
The hallucination aspect, and where a lot of the vendors, they try to unnecessarily shoehorn Gen AI into a product that doesn't really need it is obvious. But there's definitely kind of assistive technologies where it really helps cybersecurity. And to your point, I think a very valid use case is how it helps kind of SOC analysts interpret some of the findings, some of the use cases, help them build run books.
Yeah, I'm actually surprised that Microsoft didn't have like Copilot for Blue Screen of Death already released and ready to go, like for the most recent issues. But maybe it's coming. Who knows?
Gents, that was a great discussion. Thanks so much for your time. Thank you for joining. We'll see you next time. Big Questions in Tech with Errol Reply. Thank you.
Subscribe now to never miss an episode of the Big Questions in Tech.